Okay, welcome everyone. This is ANC 34G. We're meeting on a special meeting, and this is to discuss the reports from the various working groups for the Task Force on Racism. Shannon is going to provide a little bit more background, but this task force has been working since last June, and she'll bring us up to speed on where we stand right now. But first, let me have them introduce themselves. The commissioners who are here, have been working, facilitating with the task force over the last three or 4 months. Shandy, you want to introduce yourself first? Well, I should introduce myself. I'm Randy Speck. I'm chair of ANC 34G, and I represent the single member district that's ANC 34G03, basically from Nebraska over to Utah and over to Broad Branch. Shanda?
Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for attending our groundbreaking town hall meeting tonight. I'm Shanda Tuck Garfield, and I represent ANC 34G02, which is on the part of the district that's closest to Oregon Avenue and Utah and Military Road. Thanks again for coming tonight.
And Jerry?
Sure. I'm Jerry Mallitz. I'm the commissioner for another 6.5 weeks with ANC 3G05. That's the east side of Connecticut Avenue from Chevy Chase Circle down to about Military and across over to Broad Branch. And I'll be handling administrative duties tonight. So once these intros are through, you won't see my face on the screen anymore. You'll just see a name that is there. So I'll be doing a lot of other things at this meeting.
Okay, and we are getting better and better at doing the Zoom meetings, but bear with us if we run into any technical glitches. We'll try to get those handled quickly if we do. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. This is an important meeting for our commission. We're tackling a difficult issue, and we want to have as much community participation in this as we can. First, I want to say what a great job all of the members of the task force have done. We've got a number of people who've been working on this very diligently for the last 3.5, 4 months. And some of them I know have met every week during that time period. And they've done a lot of research. We've had a lot of very tough discussions sometimes, discussions that got into sensitive issues and topics that were important to our community, but the task force has just done a remarkable job in pulling all of that together. And these are your neighbors. These are people just like you. They're trying to do the best we can for our community to make it better. We may disagree about some things, about tactics particularly, or about exactly how we ought to accomplish our goals, but everyone here is working in good faith. Everyone is working, trying to better the community. We need to recognize that we're all working in this together. And we share the same desire to improve our community. And as I mentioned before, this is a hard task we're undertaking here. There are sometimes issues that in our historic past that are uncomfortable, and that we are having a confrontation with those both as a country and as a city and as a community. And so it's sometimes difficult to face all of those issues, and try to work out a real solution that's going to improve the situation for everyone. So the final thing I would mention is that keep in mind that the ANC's authority, if we have any, is limited. As the name implies, we are advisory. And so we have to make our case to others, frequently the district government, to the mayor, to the council, sometimes to the National Park Service, we've learned. Federal government sometimes gets involved, but we have to make our case to them that things need to be done to improve our community. And so we have to make a persuasive case there. And that requires frequently, almost always, that we have broad community support. And so that's what we're looking for in coming to you today is to get your input and your thoughts, your questions about how we can work together to achieve some of the goals that we've set out for ourselves. So that's where we stand right now. That's where we're going to begin discussing the reports that have been prepared by the task force groups, working groups. And those reports are, as I'm sure all of you know, are on our ANC website, available for everyone to take a look at. And so I'm going to turn it over to Shanda then, and she's going to introduce the first part of the discussion with some of the representatives from the working groups. And then we'll turn it over to all of you to have questions. And I should mention, Jerry had mentioned this, I think, before we actually got formally started, but if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A. Or if you want to ask your question yourself, you can electronically raise your hand, and Jerry will endeavor to recognize you. We're trying to keep everyone's comments or questions to about 3 minutes. Until everyone's had a chance to ask at least one question. And then we'll try to wrap up with any other questions other people have if they want to go through a second round. So Shanda, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Randy. Good evening, everyone. And as I said before, welcome to tonight's groundbreaking discussion. I'm very excited to be able to have this discussion with you all as members of the community. And we're looking forward to a wonderful discussion where we listen to what has been presented and listen to the views of our neighbors and comments and questions. And some of you may be asking our initial question, why Task Force on Racism? Why this? Why now? As Randy mentioned, our ANC in June of this year, of 2020, faced with our concerns and community concerns about incidents of injustices that were happening around the nation, specifically racial injustices to citizens of the US, we thought it was time for our community not only to take a hard look at ourselves, hard and a good look at ourselves, to see what, if anything, we can contribute not only to our community of Chevy Chase, DC, but to the larger community, and to serve as an example, as a shining example and a beacon of light for not only our community, our residents, both young and old, our children and neighbors, here in our community and throughout DC, but for the larger country and ultimately the world. As some of you may know, our task force, which our ANC, and we basically passed a resolution, and part of that resolution, which I'll read to you, but it's also on our website, it included the creation of a task force to identify and propose concrete solutions to the community. We emphasized that we, as a task force and as an ANC, wanted to focus on substantive issues and specific actions and action steps that the ANC can take. And basically the task force was charged with determining priorities based on input from the community, from members such as you. And so with that, the great emphasis was on developing realistic steps to impact people's lives. And as a part of that, as Randy mentioned, you know that for the past 3 to 4 months, our working groups, which ultimately were divided into 3, the first being in alphabetical order, community, the second, education and health, and the third, housing. And each of those 3 working groups, comprised of citizens just like you and me, undertook this volunteer task, and it was all volunteer, to use not only their expertise as individuals to basically support our ANC in our effort with brainstorming, identifying, and discussing issues. And so with that, tonight, you're going to actually hear from members that are representing each of the 3 work groups. Initially, we'll start out with a panel, which will be comprised of the representatives of each work group. and I will ask them initial questions that members of the ANC, along with some of the panelists, thought that we should address first before we should open it up to you as a community to ask. The ground rules for this, as Commissioner Malice, you may have heard mentioned, are that if you have questions, you should put the question in the Q&A. You also should electronically raise your hand during this point. The first portion of the moderated panel would be comprised of the first 30 minutes, and our commission wanted to really use the last hour or so that we can get your input and have your questions ultimately in this, because it is a community effort and we really want to make this the best task force as possible. And as you said, we said why now and why not? And we want to use our brainstorming capabilities to come up with the best for our community. So with that, I think we'll take a moment to transition to the moderated panel section. And Jerry, did you want to start that part?
Okay, name off the people that you want me to elevate to panelists.
Yeah. And with that, I will introduce our panelists. As I see, there's Connie Chang. Hi, Connie. She will be representing one of the members representing the housing working group this evening. We should also have, I believe, Sarah Ramus from the housing working group will be speaking this evening. We'll also have Michael Gibbons representing the education and health work group. And we will have for the community work group tonight, Commissioner-elect Lisa Gore. And let me back up and congratulate Commissioner-elect Connie Chang as well. And we will have former Commissioner Gary Thompson. Welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time tonight to represent your working groups.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
Okay, at this moment, I think we're waiting on Lisa Gore and Gary Thompson.
They're both there.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, my screen. I guess I have
there.
too many boxes open that I don't see everyone. Let me take
Yeah.
them down. Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. As I mentioned before, we're going to have a conversation between myself and the members of the working group, and I'm going to put out some questions which the members will address. And then after we do that portion, we'll transition to an open Q&A from the community. And as a part of the open Q&A, you're representing your working groups, but if there are specific questions that you may not have the answer to at that point, you can let us know and we will, I guess, forward that question to another member of your working group that you identify, and if they're here on the call. Okay? All right, so with that, I'm very excited to move now into our questions. One of the pieces with all the working groups, and this is going to be the same question for all three groups, and you all can answer this one. Basically, with each work group, you initially came together and identified or brainstormed on specific issue areas that you thought the community should address. So I think our community needs to know, like, what were your methodologies? How did you come up with these specific recommendations? As the community may know, and you can go on the website for ANC3G.org, each of you have draft reports, and those draft reports range anywhere from 20 to 30 pages up to 80 pages. Shows that there was a lot of in-depth work. So with that, we could start with housing. And would you all, as representatives, tell us how you came up with your top priorities on this process?
So thanks all. We're really excited to hear your feedback about our project. Our methodologies was we started looking at the history of our neighborhood. How did this neighborhood is overwhelmingly white, and we asked ourselves, how did this happen? We looked at the Black communities that were kicked out of this neighborhood in the 1920s and 1930s at Broad Branch Road and at Fort Reno. We looked at government policies that kept the neighborhood white as it was developed by the Chevy Chase Land Company and beyond. We looked at things like redlining and the difficulty traditionally that Black families had getting mortgages at reasonable rates because of racist policies by the government. We looked at racially exclusionary zoning laws that that at first explicitly forbade members of racial minorities to move here, and then later moved on to things like requiring certain single family houses and certain size lots that made it financially unaffordable to many people. And we looked at how those laws continue now to have a racially disparate impact, including looking at statistically and on average that Black families or Black homeowners are often given mortgages at higher interest rates despite high levels of creditworthiness. And then we went from there to see what policies what recommendations can we make that specifically target those racist policies in the past. So for example, with racially, one of the reasons why our neighborhood was allowed to grow as an largely white neighborhood was, as I mentioned, the racially explicit zoning laws. And so what can we do now to walk that back, unwind that, and undo those effects? And similarly, because other policies made home buying so much more expensive for would-be Black homeowners, what can we do to have housing at a range of income points to make up for 100 years of denying Black homeowners the ability to gain equity by buying houses in our neighborhood? So that was our methodology.
Thank you, Sarah. And now we'll move to education. And Michael, would you answer that same question in terms of your methodology, your background, and what went into you determining your priorities?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with everybody. Somewhat similar. Our group includes parents with children currently in Lafayette School and the schools in our catchment area, past parents, students, and concerned citizens. So we first, like the housing group, considered the history of historic systemic racism in our city and in our community, and the segregated tradition that began with schooling in our neighborhood. We acknowledge that. That's a first step of anti-racist good practice, acknowledging the existence of systemic racism and its historic roots and the way current privileges benefit from that situation. Secondly, we reviewed research and information about key issues in education and health equity and disparity in our city today, and how those obtain in our neighborhood. And then third, we discussed local school practices and family experiences in our neighborhood and in adjacent neighborhoods that either exacerbate, contribute to, or ignore the disparities that currently exist. And I would just say, a general conclusion of that exploration found that while there are a very limited amount of disparities inside our neighborhood, that generally most of our families are insulated from those disparities inside our neighborhood by virtue of the hurdles they have to overcome to enter the neighborhood. We acknowledged fully that our neighborhood participates in severe disparities across neighborhoods. And we were not doing enough or very much to engage around that cross neighborhood disparity in health and education. And that was really our starting point for considering action.
Thank you for that, Michael. And now we'll move to community, because similar to housing, community deals with issues that were identified, and we have Lisa as well as Gary Thompson. And so with that, community, I'm sure some people are like, that could be a lot to chew. It's a huge community. So Lisa, would you tell us how community, what was the methodology with the community work group and your mission and goals, and how the working group was able to come up, and exactly what did you do? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Chanda. And thanks for everyone to be on the call tonight. And like the other group, there was a lot of brainstorming that initially went into the community group's ultimate recommendations that we have before the ANC. We started out with a very broad brainstorming session as well to come up with our top concerns and recommendations that we thought would benefit the community. And we kind of went from an aspect that I would say moving from awareness, so basically community awareness, education, and learning, to coming up with formulations of specific concrete actions that the community could take to, help them learn and understand about the issues that we face in Chevy Chase, the district, and as you said, nationwide. So our initial brainstorming sessions, when everyone came together, we came up with roughly, I would say, 9 to 12 recommendations, and they were across various dimensions, institutional dimensions, so district policies, to interpersonal, social. We have recommendations regarding space in the Chevy Chase Community Center. So we had a broad array of topics that we discussed. We narrowed those down even further to 8 recommendations, which are on our original draft report that we presented, or actually 11, I believe, that we presented to the ANC. And we then, after we had our initial meeting with the ANC, we took some of their recommendations into consideration and narrowed them down to 8. So they fall into 3 major core areas. The first one is community awareness, then physical environment, and district policies. And that's how we pretty much came up with it. I think the community group is really important because we approach this not from an aspect that anyone in, and I think Randy kind of touched on it, no one in our community, we feel are, ill-willed, but it is up to us to educate ourselves about this issue. And I think that's a goal and a mission that the community group took on and reflected in our final recommendations. You're on mute.
I'm ready to roll. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for that. So all of you, this is really informative in terms of showing how our community, we basically created this framework from scratch. As many people in the community may not know, Chevy Chase, DC is one of the first communities in the nation to actually take on this task, to look at ourselves, both at, for all that we are, the good and the things that need to be improved, and move that ball forward. There were no other examples for us to move forward. So each of you and each of your working groups were extremely creative in creating frameworks that looked to what I call the heart of our community. And I think residents will see that once they look at your recommendations. And that transitions me now to getting into exactly what were your recommendations. To start and circle it around, I think I'll do it in reverse order and go to community and have community. And this will be the question for all 3 work groups. We'll have community and then next housing. Connie, and then Michael, if each of you could address what exactly out of, for instance, the recommendations you had. I know housing had over 8, at least 8. Education had a number as well as community. So with that large number of recommendations, our community may be saying, wow, how can we do this all? And the ANC may even be saying that. So if you could tell us, although all the recommendations are important, what you identify as the top priorities with these recommendations. And with that, Gary, we'll start with you, then move to Connie, and then go to Michael.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. We have 10 people in our community group, and we, like Lisa mentioned, we brainstormed a lot of recommendations, and we didn't really rank them in terms of priority, but just sort of trying as best I can to respond to your question. Our first recommendation is to make this entire task force an ongoing permanent thing. And that's because we can't do all this in just, 6 or 10 meetings. This requires a lot of work over a lot of time. So I think that's probably our top recommendation, is to empower us on behalf of the ANC and the community to keep going at this. Probably also near the top of the list is some immediate changes to the physical environment that we've identified. We've heard for a long time about the need to dename the Newlands Fountain. That process is underway in conjunction with the National Park Service. Hopefully that's going to get a lot easier after around mid-January to work with them. I think we should just try to get that denamed and move on from there, possibly towards renaming. Our report identifies some other possible physical changes in the neighborhood, ultimately, and most importantly, I think, carving out some space in the community center so that we can continue as a community to discuss these issues, have educational events, and continue to inform ourselves. And probably also near the top of the list in my view, and I think probably everybody shares this in our group, is our 8th recommendation, which is just to be more engaged with the district as a whole. This city is constantly, through its council and through its mayor's office and the many agencies, trying to improve how we approach these issues. And sometimes in Chevy Chase, we read the post, we're sort of aware, but we're not fully engaged in that broader city conversation. These issues don't stop at ANC borders or ward borders. We've got to be more engaged, and that's our recommendation in that regard. Is not just through our work group, but everybody should try to follow those things more closely. Work with our council members, our incoming new Ward 4 council member. Just try to be more engaged and express our opinions. See if our ANC as a body would like to express points of view. Get before subcommittees and committees and testify, and just be a part of the city conversation as a whole.
Thank you, Gary. And now Connie, would you tell us about housing?
Sure. It's great to follow Gary because I think we were also motivated by being part of the district. We're Ward 3 and there's 8 wards, and we're part of the District of Columbia. And I think that what we have in terms of like what we are as a community, as a neighborhood, is those races past, but we also have before us a comprehensive plan. And the mayor is asking Rock Creek West, wards 3 and 4, to do our part. Right now, we only represent 1% of affordable housing units. That's just 1%. It's very low. It's like 500 units. And even if we included all the rent controlled units in that figure, it's only 7%. And there's not a lot of new affordable housing coming in, expected to be constructed. And so it really is incumbent upon us to try to meet this goal of bringing in 1,990 units by 2025. And we took that to heart. That was part of what we discussed as a group. And so your question about what are our top priorities, I think the top priority really for us is where can we build more affordable housing here in our ward. So first recommendation is we've got public land, which is where the community center and the library sit. They already have a budget of about $38 million each, right? I mean, together. to be modernized. And we wanted this because we have things that we want in our community, activities and so forth, and a nicer building to walk into. And the ANC already earlier this year proposed in the comprehensive plans amendments to add affordable housing units. And I think that would be the top priority, meaning it's already happening, and a small area plan is going to commence very soon with the Office of Planning. And we, in this task force, in this work group, are recommending that that all stakeholders get involved in that. So that's number one, is to be engaged in that and to build affordable housing units. They're at least 50% mixed income. So it's not like, I'm from New York, so it's not like the big, tall public housing buildings that you see. I want to just absolutely just tell you that it's not that we're envisioning. You know, it's local businesses, retail on the bottom. There's going to be activities. Other cities do that where they mix the two, and affordable housing units in there. And we can deal with the details later. Along with that would be Connecticut Avenue. It is a commercial corridor. We already have a lot of buildings south of Livingston that we're used to, right? That are there, and that they house a lot of renters. Now, on north of Connecticut Avenue, there are private developments, meaning private owners, Safeway, for instance, Wells Fargo. I mean, these are all places where perhaps we could build more housing that's affordable, and we would have to talk to them, and we would have to figure out how that's possible. But that's something that we can work on and work together as a community. And then I would say that the rest of the recommendations, okay, is number one, we have rental units that are affordable already, market rate affordable. Let's try to keep it there, and let's try to engage with that rent control reform. We have to think about inside, you know, not just the commercial corridor, but inside where a lot of us live, how can we add more affordable units? And that's the missing middle piece, the gentle density. And that's critical. So it's not just two, but it's two ideas that are priority, which is how to doing it. And those are our recommendations. And I really hope you guys read them carefully. There's a lot in that report.
Yes, thank you. All of the reports, both community and housing, as well as education, everyone had in-depth recommendations. So I definitely encourage the community to read those. Thank you, Connie. And so now we'll have Michael address the same question on the education and health front.
Thanks again. It's wonderful to follow Gary and Connie because we're on the same path. We also feel as if our general recommendation as a collective of all three is to join the city's anti-racist actions urgently, and to participate fully in the life of our city as it advances that agenda, and on many fronts. So in education and health, first of all, we honed in on education and mental health in order to define a somewhat more manageable and interlinked agenda. You know, the essence of anti-racist good practice is A, to do no harm, B, to learn about and acknowledge privilege where it exists, and C, to serve as constant allies to those directly affected by structural racism, and to accompany them in a joint commitment to undoing structural racism. So with that in mind, we winnowed down our topical agenda to 5 key issues: equalizing school financing, deepening racial justice curriculum and learning in our schools, closing ed tech gaps that have opened up and been revealed by the pandemic, expanding social emotional learning programs to deal with stress that arises from systemic racism, and 5th, to foster greater community engagement on equity within DC public schools. So across those 2, if I were to summarize the priorities, I would say 1, We want to build on our local schools' fundraising practice and racial justice curriculum and social emotional learning program innovation. We actually do those things well as local schools. To contribute directly to wider efforts to build capacity for similar good practices in schools and neighborhoods with less privileges and resources in our city. So rather than patting ourselves on the back for our good practice, we want to spread good practice in collaboration with other schools and neighborhoods. Secondly, we want to mobilize our community to work with citywide advocates to institutionalize within DCPS more equitable funding mechanisms and anti-racist curriculum and social emotional learning program practices as normal to DCPS operating procedures and curriculum. So we pledge to collaborate on both of those areas. And they do require ongoing work. So we need an ongoing mechanism around which then ongoing community voluntary effort could be organized so that we sustain these efforts over time. Dismantling structural racism is not the work of a short-term intervention. It's an ongoing process, political season by political season, campaign by campaign, and it's an iterative process of learning together. So that's what we would propose.
Thank you, Michael. Each of your working groups have really informed us on what your top priorities are now. And I think you've done a wonderful job. But it's interesting because I also think back to our ANC meeting because the commissioners, we had a number of questions. So our next round and the last question for our panel tonight is going to focus on recommendations at our ANC meetings that had lots of questions. And then we will go in the order of having education briefly go first, then we'll have housing, and then next community. And the three areas of the questions that were raised the most were, and I'll put them out there, but I'll put the question out again as we go around to each work group. With education, at our last meeting, the ANC commissioners had a number of questions on the funding piece and how, out of all these recommendations, how exactly that would work. With community, there were a number of questions that dealt with the proposal to create a rapid response listserv and how would we address that. With housing, there were questions that looked at, wow, you know, our community, we're not experts on a lot of these issues. And what exactly did it mean with your recommendation number 5, dealing with the general density issue? So I just want to tackle those for each of those recommendations for each of your work groups before and have each of you answer them. And then after you answer them, we'll transition into the public section where residents of our community can ask you various questions, which we at this moment do not know what they will be, but I'm sure you'll be able to address them. And if you cannot, we'll transition over. So with that, we'll start with Michael. And if you could address the funding recommendation that the Education and Health Group put forward.
Of course. What we recommend there is an attempt to reduce the disparity between parent-teacher organization, private fundraising at DC neighborhood public schools. Generally, the funding formula for schools is an equal apportionment per child of a core amount for all DC traditional public schools, supplemented then by Title I and other federal and state funding mechanisms that compensate for disparities of income and opportunity. Nonetheless, even with all of that in the formula, extremely privileged schools in the Northwest DC corridor generally come out with much more robust budgets than their counterpart schools. And one exacerbating component of that is the disparate ability of homeschool associations to do private fundraising and raise significant sums to a much greater extent than other communities in the city. So one good question that arose was whether we would limit support for expanded support, capacity building and fundraising to just DC neighborhood public schools, or whether we would include charter schools, private schools, and private voucher programs. And I wanted to be clear that we limited ourselves to DC neighborhood public schools for an important reason. Almost all charter schools, as they're established with their independent charters, are built with a fundraising capability inside the school operating mechanism from the get-go. And in particular, charter schools that are part of national or regional chains of schools like KIPP schools and others have prodigious fundraising capabilities in their headquarters office. Similarly, private schools all have fundraising departments, and private school voucher programs are predicated on fundraising capability. That's their main job, is raising money in order to pool money, in order to allocate for vouchers. So DC public schools by rule cannot have fundraising staff. That's not an allowable budget item for DC traditional public schools. They therefore have to rely on the volunteerism of their parent associations. Now, across the city, the poorest neighborhoods have the hardest time organizing PTOs, parent teachers associations. And the privileges and positioning of parents who do join those is very different than those in our neighborhood in particular, and other Ward 3 school HSAs in general. So therefore, we have a disproportionate capacity to raise private funds, and that results in annual significant disparities of private fundraising money that then is apportioned on top of our budget. So for that reason, we honed in there on that particular structural inequality, where we appreciate that those who choose charter schools and those who choose private schools or a voucher program as a pathway for their children are banking on the fundraising prowess of those organizations to help them in raising money for those entities. And we just think it's a good example of practicing the anti-racist practice of do no harm. Let's not add to the problem. So for that reason, we recommended moving beyond a small voluntary contribution by our Lafayette School Homeschool Association to a pooled fund to share with other schools, to a much more ambitious undertaking to actually work with other Ward 3 schools to form a pooled aggregated fund that would directly transfer some of the funds raised by us and some of the funds raised jointly with non-Ward 3 schools to supplement budgets of schools not as privileged as our own. So it's a much more forceful effort to share fundraising capacity in order to share supplemental resources more fairly.
Thank you for explaining that, Michael. And I'm sure some of our audience members will have more questions on that issue, but I think your response provides an in-depth answer to a question that a number of us had, like why that particular priority. But thank you. So we're now well educated on that piece. And next we'll transition to the working group member for, I think, did I say community was next, or are we going to go housing? like we could do community and address the Rapid Response Network, and whoever from the community, Lisa, Gary, one of you want to address that one for us?
We can tag team on that one. So I think as a result of the last meeting, there was a couple of questions that came up about the Rapid Response Network. So I'll just kind of give you my thoughts about it and try to address some of the issues that came up. So, and there's also a member on our group that really, I'm not sure if he's on the line, but Cal really had this concept in mind from the beginning. So if he is on, he should be allowed input into this conversation as well. But the concept was to kind of create a vehicle or an avenue for people in our community that have been subject to a racial incident, a network that would be comprised of members of our community, maybe even members outside of our community, because one of the things that we talked about is doing this as a network. So there are a lot of other organizations out there that have experience in this that we would hopefully partner with to kind of create a mechanism for reporting of those particular incidents. One of the things that I would say is that we all kind of talked about in the community group, this concept is a very broad concept at this stage. And there would have to be a lot of refinement. There's a lot of things that we need to discuss. Some of the issues that we talked about amongst ourselves was creating it so that our community doesn't feel policed. And that no one feels unfairly accused. So I have a law enforcement background, and we talked about how important it is to accurately report. So one of the things that we discussed was what information do we provide to the community? So if a racial incident does occur, how do we notify the community that it has occurred, what happened, and how do we ensure accuracy? So the information that we are reporting extremely accurately. So these are things that we're going to have to work out with. We talked about working with legal, I believe the Office of ANC, to kind of answer some of those questions for us so that we protect everybody's right and their privacy. Some victims are not going to want information conveyed to the community, and some victims will. So one of the things too, I think is important about this is we will also have a idea of, and this will have to be built up. So community awareness will be important, but we'll have kind of a baseline of what's going on in our community. We do have some incidents that have been reported in the past, including, theft of, or, vandalism of signs, BLM signs. We had a young lady, and some people on the call might have read this on the listserv, and I believe it was on Neighbor Next Door, that reported some racial harassment incidents with her and her kids. She was a family member at Lafayette, and they since moved out of the neighborhood. So we've had incidents, but we don't know the extent, we don't know the degree, and we don't know how victims are dealing with those incidents within our community. So part of this is to create a support network, not only where they can, reach out to someone to let them know, but it's also important to reach out to someone that can offer them assistance. So whether that's walking them through certain steps and processes that we develop, to include, is it possibly rising to the level of a criminal activity? So there are hate crimes, but those are governed by laws, both local and federal. Is it something that I just want to, air and make sure that the community is aware of? Is it something that we need to be aware of? Even, you think of an incident in terms of graffiti, somebody having graffiti on their property, is there, resources that we can provide to them to help them cure that situation as well? So I think it's personally a concept that we've come up with in community that I really like. I think it's very helpful. And as a minority member of this community, that's something I would want to know. And it would be something that if I'm coming into a community, regardless of where it's located throughout the United States, I would love to have that information. We have seen models that are derived around educational institutions. So, and I agree, and I would piggyback, Chanda, when you said, our work is kind of groundbreaking, because when we researched this particular network response system, we didn't really find anything out there. We didn't find anything that kind of modeled what we really want to do here. The closest things came from educational institutions where they had, harassment hotlines on a campus. There are definitely some also models that are based off of immigrant communities, but none where we found were community-based and specifically dealt with racial incidents. So I think it's important for everyone to know that. I mean, this is groundbreaking. And our community group, and I'm sure whoever is in the permanent task force, if it is, adopted by the ANC, we're not afraid of this work. We know that it's going to require work. We know that it's going to require dedication to really figure this out. And it's going to involve, reaching out and networking with our community, because we don't want to set up something that the community is going to be opposed to. So we're going to have to include the community in this process so they really know where our heart lies with creating this type of network. And it is from a victim perspective. So that's what I would like to say about that.
Well, thank you, Lisa. That's excellent, because you are right. These proposals are groundbreaking and innovative. We are, as I say, breaking out of the box with our ANC. I mean, some people would say, wow, who would have thought Chevy Chase, DC would be, but we are. I mean, there's so many stereotypes about our community. And yes, while the statistics do say, they're right, it is a majority white community. Statistically. However, the citizens of this community of all backgrounds, races, and cultures are really coming together for the first time. And this is groundbreaking and proposing things which, as you mentioned, have not been done before. So, and we talked about coming into it with a heart, a good heart. We have that heart. Chevy Chase DC has it. And I think our residents are seeing it tonight. So with that, I'll transition to housing. Speaking of good heart issues, housing, some people in the community may say, wow, well, the ANC, already supported the city's plans for creating, using the library and the community center to, look at and create housing on the avenue. So there are people out there who may say that. So why is your recommendation 5 dealing with general density necessary? And first of all, can you quickly, I know it's a complicated subject, tell us and define that for us as you go along and telling us and updating us on that recommendation.
Okay, thank you. Let me just read out the recommendation 5, the full recommendation, so everyone's on the same page. Recommendation 5 is study ways to permit familiar, modest home choices called gentle density without disrupting the look and feel of the neighborhood. And we ask for a key action of the ANC, because we're just a work group. We need to recommend things that the ANC can take action on. So we urge the ANC to urge the Office of Planning to study the feasibility and appropriateness of gentle density. And there's already been a publication out, an April 2020 publication called Single Family Zoning in the District of Columbia, and how those recommendations in there could be implemented. And in particular, the impact on existing neighborhoods, the creation of form-based codes, which is one way to make sure that developers follow what we would like to see, and strategies for achieving affordability goals. So let me say this, it is not enough to just take that commercial strip and build housing. You're going to get resistance if you build very, 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 very tall buildings and you pack everyone in. That's not what we're talking about. As a neighborhood, if you build in density, and that means a single family home in other neighborhoods across the US, I've lived in many of them, single family homes, same plot, I guess, can hold a duplex. You know, you can construct it so that the profile, when you look at it, looks just like any other house. You could also have a triplex or a quadplex. You could see this even on the avenue. I walked with my mother today and I was like, whoa, there's a lot going on here. And
Yep.
there are really single family homes turned into these duplexes, and it allows you to make better use of your land. I mean, I personally don't want people to cut down more trees and build. And, you know, that's not what I want as a citizen of the United States. We're in a city for a reason. You know, I chose to live here because I like to be near a commercial area. I'm not living in a very rural area. So for me and for others on this work group, we thought, okay, what is this concept that other progressive cities are looking at? This gentle density or missing middle housing, which is housing that were available in areas, and then with single family zoning, they were taken out for many reasons. And in our neighborhood, it was single family houses are more expensive. And at that time in the 1920s, really only white families could afford it. And though decades later, you saw other people of color, they were largely people who were domestics, you know, who worked for these large families, these white families. And so for us to build back in these homes that could increase density in a gentle way, and I could read you that definition which you asked for, Shonda, is gentle density refers to allowing additional housing density through context sensitive development, development that respects neighborhood character while considering neighborhood priorities such as affordable housing and public facilities. The types of housing that could fit within a single family neighborhood will vary, but could include many different types of missing middle housing that are compatible in scale and design with single family homes. For example, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, as I mentioned, residential flats, and also another recommendation of ours is accessory dwelling units and small multi-unit buildings in this neighborhood. Okay, so like you could see on Connecticut Avenue, I wasn't even aware, I just walked by, and south of Legation, right on the corner, there was a home, and now I think it's about 5 stories high. They built a small, I'm assuming a condo building there. So inside where I am on Nevada, you know, even my own home, which over the years I've expanded, if you look at my house, I was just talking to a neighbor and she said, your door, which sits at the middle, if this were a duplex, it's perfect for a duplex. Your side windows could be 2 doorway entries, and then you could house 2 families. Now, this kind of configuration, it's for bringing young families in, people of color who might have in diversity of income, race, ethnicity, right? But it's also for those of us who may be older and who need a caretaker, and you want to be able to perhaps separate your house if you can do that and turn it into a duplex. I mean, those are things that I know I've thought of and others have thought of. So that idea is to bring in more housing options, have more inclusivity, more diversity, and to do it in a way that doesn't disrupt how we might feel as our walkable, tree-lined, beautiful neighborhood, which we all love. We live here. And so that is, that sort of lies at the heart of it. And we're not saying do it now. We're saying study it, because other cities have studied and have done it. They've done it their way. We are we. And so we would like the ANC to study it, okay? To study it and to be a part of that study. And anything that we feel uncomfortable with, we should bring that forward. But that should be done in a way that makes us feel like we can do the right thing and not feel like, you know, this doesn't look like my neighborhood any longer. So that's sort of the heart of that recommendation. And I'm happy, and Sarah's happy, and others on there's 7 of us, are happy to jump in and to add to. But our report really does show a lot of the work that we did in investigating this. There's a whole book on middle missing housing that costs $40 on Amazon, which I have not yet bought, but I will. And there's a lot of work that's been done in considering what these things mean and what these concepts mean. And so we want to bring it forth so that we can consider it, so that we're like on the ball, you know, and to examine it and to see how can it fit in so that we can do our part as district residents.
Thank you for that, Connie, and explaining it. And thank you to all of our panelists for explaining these recommendations. And I noticed in our chat as you were speaking, Connie, there are residents who are asking, you know, for evidence of certain issues. And so I believe our work groups, and Connie, you've shown that we want to not only research things as a part of our report, we want to continue to study them. This work group worked over the past 4 months. And so with these recommendations, there are both there's a short-term and long-term outlook. 3 to 4 months is not enough time to gather some of this evidence. So our hope, and actually our challenge to our community, and I say that because as an African-American woman, I challenge our community to basically openly discuss these issues and not to basically end the discussion before we have evidence and discussions and ideas that are put forth. This working group's ideas, as many of the members have told you, they are not to be taken only as their own ideas, but we're welcoming community ideas. And so as we transition into our next section to answer your questions, and they're great questions that you're posing. And also I thank you, panelists, for the answers, but it leaves me to think of one quote from John Lewis. And this quote, when I see it all the time, it always leads me to the question of why not? Why can't we do something? Why can't we at least try? And the quote is, he says, when you see something that's not right, not fair, not just, you have to speak up. You have to say something. You have to do something. So with that thought in mind, I want to transition us to the open dialogue with the community so that we can begin as a community to walk hand in hand together. And as you know, with our ANC, our commissioners, all of us believe in openness and transparency. And so today is the next step in the process of bringing that transparency to you. And we hope that the future ANC meetings where the commission will discuss this, and in the new year, when our new commissioners elect, take this up and move this ball forward, that we all as a community can go forward together and basically speak up for our community and do good work. So with that, Randy, I'll transition it over to you and we can get started.
Okay, Shanda?
Yes.
Yes, so we've received 8 questions so far.
Okay.
I'm just going to let people in the order that they ask the questions. I would ask that everybody identify themselves when they're allowed to talk. And that's how we were planning to proceed. Randy, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
The one thing I was going to add is that all 3 of the groups emphasized that this is not a short-term operation. And these are all issues that are going to require the ANC's commitment over a long period of time and the community's commitment over a long period of time. We're all going to have to be working on these. They won't happen overnight. And so I look forward to working with the new commissioners who are going to come in January and with all of the community, because all of us are going to be involved in these, and it's going to require a lot of hard work by all of us to get this actually done. And we don't want this to just be a report that sits on the shelf someplace or sits in a hard drive someplace. We want this to be a commitment by our community to get these things done. So, okay, Jerry, you can go ahead and start.
The first question comes from Mara, and I'm going to allow you to talk. And remember, identify yourself with your full name. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Unmute yourself, Mara, and you're good to go.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mara Verheyden Hilliard. I'm a lifelong resident of the district, and in fact, I grew up in this neighborhood. And I am a civil rights lawyer whose practice includes the district and around the country. And I appreciate the efforts that are going on here as the country itself is engaged in an extraordinary reckoning with its racist historical past, and it's even dealing in the immediate with not just vestiges of racism, but racism that people live and breathe every single day throughout the United States. And when it comes to the issue of housing, which is what I wanted to address and ask questions about, I've read through the report and I've listened with interest to what everyone has talked about tonight. And I'm very concerned that the report, while it addresses and while the discussion is addressing how we got here and the historic, extraordinarily vicious racism of this neighborhood and how it was built, the report and the recommendations don't then turn to solutions that address how we get to affordable housing and how we actually end up having a more diverse neighborhood as we should have. The elephant in the room, and what is never discussed in the report and in the recommendations, is the fact that we are in the midst of an affordable housing crisis in the District of Columbia that is caused by the developers of the District of Columbia. The affordable housing crisis, the fact that Black families are being forced out of their homes throughout the district is interrelated with the lack of diversity in this neighborhood. This did not happen by accident. It didn't happen because there was an act of nature or an act of God. It happened because it was a concerted effort by developers in the District of Columbia who have forced out families as they have gentrified neighborhoods. I mean, even right now, as we are talking about increasing density to allow developers to build more housing in this neighborhood, those same developers are forcing families out of their homes in housing areas throughout the district where they are taking public housing or affordable housing, forcing people out and trying to turn those into for-profit housing. So the bottom line is, there is no recommendation in that report that is going to end up with affordable housing in this area merely by increasing density and allowing the developers to come in. I note in the report, it has language that refers to, like on page 18 and page 20, encouraging developers to do the right thing. And the requirement that developers maybe only have 10%, or we could hope for 20% of affordable housing, will do nothing to provide affordable housing units. So I think the conversation is really missing the main point. The reason that we don't have affordable housing is because of the developers, and upsizing, upzoning this area, Connecticut Avenue, our neighborhoods will not do one thing to increase affordable housing and change diversity in this area, so long as the developers are given license and have a role as to how that housing develops. And I think if we want to talk about new and powerful initiatives and really having this neighborhood take the lead, we need to talk about social housing, about the extraordinary possibilities of social housing where you take the profit out of it, a model that's been used successfully in Vienna, Australia, that is very popular, things that I don't see discussed at all in here. And I know that I'm on time, but I just want to make one more point as an evidentiary matter. You need only look at Bloomingdale in the District of Columbia to understand how these things happen, because restrictive covenants were struck by the Supreme Court in the 40s. Even though they continued to be used by gentlemen's agreement. Now, Bloomingdale then became a majority Black neighborhood as the restrictive covenants were struck. So it isn't just the vestige of restrictive covenants, it's what happens after that with the profiteering developers. Yeah. Those Black families have been forced out of Bloomingdale because the developers have gentrified that neighborhood. That is proof positive that lifting the restrictive covenants isn't the single thing, that changing the nature of the laws and the restrictions doesn't do it. So long as the developers are profiting off of the upzoning, which is what this report will allow them to do, that's what will happen. And I highly recommend that there be no vote on this report until the new ANC is seated, next January, and we have an opportunity for there to be much wider neighborhood discussion because very few people are aware of this. Thank you.
I think Commissioner Speck is going to address that. Thank you, Ms. Verheyden Hilliard. I'm going to pass it over to Commissioner Speck. You raised very good points and we appreciate that. One thing that we will note with this report is that 3 to 4 months is not enough time, and that is why a number of the recommendations were put under the auspices of to study. And I will now transfer that over to Commissioner Speck.
Mara, thank you for that question. We were very cognizant of this particular problem, and we've addressed it from the beginning of our examination of the comprehensive plan, because that was our big concern. Are we going to just upzone all of these spaces along Connecticut Avenue for developers to come in and build whatever they want to build? That's why the ANC has been really pretty proactive on this from the beginning. And our recommendations are also very proactive. We are recommending, as I'm sure you read, for the library and the community center, that housing be 50% affordable, and with various levels of affordability. And we think that that's reasonable, and particularly because this is public land, and we ought to be able to do that. We ought to be able to make the economics work for that. For the other developments along Connecticut Avenue, we have proposed in our recommendations that they be 25% affordable housing. This is going to all come about through the small area plan, and that's going to be a key component here that will specify exactly how that area is supposed to be developed. And this is going to have intensive community input over the next year as the Office of Planning begins to formulate that small area plan. And so we want to, our concern is exactly yours, that we want to make sure that this is all going to be affordable. And that includes, by the way, general density. There's no guarantee that if you build a duplex or a triplex, that's going to be affordable. But we think there are ways that should be studied to determine and make sure that it would be affordable, because that's our objective all along here. It's not to create a lot of luxury units. I just saw an article in the paper today said that luxury units aren't even selling now. So maybe this is the right time to be coming in with a lot more emphasis on affordable housing, and even the what's called inclusionary zoning plus that has just been rolled out. That only goes up to 20%. We don't think that's adequate. And so what we're trying to do is influence this process and make sure that indeed we do get affordable housing in this neighborhood. That's our only objective here. And we're going to be determined to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. And also to address the issue of the vote on the issue, if you will note, everyone will note, our ANC passed a resolution which said that the task force was going to recommend concrete action steps that the ANC may take. So in light of that, there's no reason why our ANC, current one, cannot vote on this before the session ends, because each of the recommendations, if you look at each of the working groups, are recommendations to the commission. And this current commission began the work, and similar to Congress, if we begin the work, we can vote on the work and then pass it to our next commissioners-elect for consideration as well.
And as someone who is going to be on both of those commissions, I want to emphasize that the work's really going to have to get done by the next commission anyway. And whatever this commission does is going to have to be passed on, and it's going to give the next commission a real head start. But Lisa and Connie and I and others are going to be working on that next year, and this is the foundation for all of that work that we're going to be doing next year.
Yes, and I encourage Ms. Verheyden Hill to continue to work with us. Please send us outside of this your ideas and information. We would love to work hand in hand with you. The next question, Jerry.
The next question, and we have a lot of questions in the queue, so please try to keep your original question or comment short so we can get to it. The next question comes, he asked two, but he'll be allowed to pick one. Carl Lankowski. Carl, you're allowed to talk. Unmute yourself and go for it.
Thanks very much, Jerry. I thought that would just be read off the screen, but my concern is not with the intentions or the actual recommendations that have been made by the 3 working groups, which I think are commendable, as I say, but how do we generate the support in the community for that? And I'd like to hear from all of the witnesses this evening on that question.
Okay. First, would we circle around? Gary, would you like to address it first? And we'll circle around into Sarah.
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, as they say, democracy belongs to those who participate. So we're going to need community engagement the next session of the ANC to bring all these, goals to life. And hopefully, people will join in and express their views. But at some point, concrete action will become the focus. Some of these recommendations, will come to life. But it's, as everyone's kind of alluded to, it's going to take it's a marathon. It's going to take a long time and a lot of commitment to achieve these objectives, especially when it comes to housing. I mean, that's a long-term commitment. So please stay engaged. Everybody that's on this call tonight, please stay engaged.
Okay, Sarah.
So I agree with Gary that the people who participate are the people who will have the loudest voices in this, which is as it should be. And specifically with regard to housing, we were the anti-racism committee. We were not the urban planning committee. We were not the architecture committee. There will be lots more people involved in, for example, the details of what the community center and library will look like. There'll be a group that looks at programmatic issues. There'll be a group that does the architecture. There'll be groups that look at other changes in the neighborhood that need to be made around traffic, for example. In 4 months, we could not possibly go down into the weeds in all of those issues. And so there will be many opportunities over the years. I think that the funding for the library, Randy, correct me if I'm wrong, is 2024, 2026, something like that?
2024.
And so in the next 4 years, there will be many opportunities to discuss what we want it to look like on a literal physical basis, and also what we want it to look like in a community and values basis.
Okay, next we'll pass it to Michael, then Lisa, and then Connie.
Thank you. And Carl, thanks for bringing this up. We really felt an affinity with between the education working group and the community working group on this subject. One of the tenets of anti-racism is learning about and engaging about privilege and about structural racism. And so this implies a learning journey of our entire community. So I would love to work with others on an ongoing strategy for community engagement in learning about racism and anti-racism. I had the privilege over the summer at American University where I work, we formed book clubs across the entire faculty to read Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and then to discuss it in small groups and to talk together about how we understood the challenges posed in every chapter of that book to ourselves, and how that would travel into our decisions about teaching, about research, and about mentoring and supporting students. And what it led to was the emergence of a working consensus across faculty at American University to engage in this work, starting with the different starting points that each of us had. And it was a beginning of a learning journey. And I would hope that our community, our neighborhood, would commit itself to a journey like that. Possible book clubs, possible community discussions, block by block or neighborhood by neighbor, nook and cranny of our neighborhood, different families with different, connecting points who would want to get together and open up conversations about this. That would then feed willingness, openness, an attitude of concern to join in some way that would grow over time in our neighborhood, and that would serve as a kind of constituency building backstop of then the actions at the ANC level that we might undertake. But we need to build consensus that we want to become a different kind of community than one that stands by and benefits from structural racism without engaging about it. And, some of the things we have to do are sacrifices of the conveniences of privilege. And some of these things are a willingness to devote time and energy to joining with others on things that don't directly affect us, but that do affect our neighbors. And those are all things we have to become educated and socially connected around in order to feel a joint willingness to do so. This is the kind of generation of shared social norms of activist commitment. And I'd love to be in a community that over time builds that kind of set of shared social norms. It's a marker of me. I'm in DC, I'm in Chevy Chase, and we're like this. We're busy with this kind of work. It also connects directly to why we wanted all of our children that pass through Lafayette School to not bypass this experience because of their privilege, but to actually have to engage about it. We want the next generation to start out life engaged about this and not to have to learn it as adults by being shielded from by privilege from these issues. So it's an intergenerational commitment over time that would fuel this and make it less controversial and would make it more of a kind of proud marker of who we are as neighbors in this community.
Shanna, you're muted.
Okay, I was saying thank you, Michael. And then next, Lisa and Connie. And I know.
Can I just interject here? We're going to run out of time if we don't keep our answers a little bit shorter and the questions a little bit shorter. We really need to pay attention to that time. Be thoughtful about other people who want to speak as well. Thank you.
Thank you for the reminder.
Oh, no, thank you.
So just to get to Carl's question, and I won't belabor the point, how do we get the community engaged? One of the things that I would recommend is a community engagement plan that the ANC develops. And that is an outreach plan. How do we reach out? And I'm looking at the participants on this list. We have 55. I looked at the participants that are not panelists, and I think I recognize one person from my current single member district. That's not sufficient to me. And as an incoming commissioner, one of the things that I've been trying to do just as an incoming commissioner is get people in my district geared up for this conversation and share that information with them. My list on my current single member district, I have maybe 60 people out of about maybe 3,000. So one of the things I think we all can do is connect with our neighbors to make sure they understand this conversation is going. And just personally, I believe this is a critical conversation that, and I think Randy said this earlier, we have got to get, we have to bring the community along, and we have to make sure that. So I don't think we have to approach it in, in terms of polarity, either we're all there or we're not there. I think there's certain things that we can maybe do now or the current commission can do now, but I think this is an ongoing conversation. And one of the way to bring people along, Carl, is to continue having the discussions that we're having today and making sure that everybody's voice is heard in those discussions. And then also follow up. I think following up, Mara brought up some really great points. And I hope there's, other opinions like that are shared with us here tonight. We have to follow up and we have to make sure that Mara understands that we are listening to her concerns and that we're addressing. That's how we bring people along and get people engaged. Because if we don't do that as a commission, whether it's the current commission or the future commission, we're not going to have people joining these calls because they're not going to think that their voice is being heard. And that's what we want to prevent. So that's Lisa's opinion.
Randy and Shannon, just so you know, there's 9 more questions already in the queue. We've taken these 2 in 22 minutes, so I suggest that
let's really keep the questions or comments to 3 minutes, Jerry, if we can do that.
Right.
Let people know when their 3 minutes is up. Okay.
But before we move, I would like Connie to briefly respond to the question.
I think Sarah did already. That's my one point, is that we are community members that were engaged in the workforce. So there's like a little ring of us who worked really hard. And now we're trying to expand that with the first October 26th public meeting, October 26th, to the ANC commissioners about making a presentation and showing you our work product. This town hall is doing it. There is nothing that's actionable, meaning no change is going to be made. It's a study of things. And so the new ANC then we'll take that on. In between, I really suggest that the current ANC take these big reports and reduce it to like a brief brochure. It allows people to engage faster than asking them to read such a big thing. I mean, the big thing's important because it's all the details. It shows what work we did and why we came up with these recommendations. But a brief booklet, and to upload this video, allow people to somehow capture their response, have smaller groups talk about it. But really next year, we will have more engagement. And so for Carl's question, that's what we'd like to do, is to make it really easy for people to engage. And so we do have a one-pager with our own recommendations and actions. I recommend that everyone do that and put it into a slim thing and share the slides, anything that we have to be able to do that so that people feel like they are a part of it. It is difficult, but it can be done. It can be done.
Okay, with that, we can move to the next question.
Okay, the next question comes from Peter Goslin. Please identify, well, I just did, identify yourself. You're unmuted, unmute yourself, and then you can go.
Great. I'm Peter Goslin. I very much agree with Randy and Chandra's opening remarks. The task force has engaged in hard, courageous, and innovative work. This community cannot deny its racist past, nor can we deny the nation's, and we need to find ways to do better. So I raise these questions about some of the housing group substantive recommendations, particularly recommendation 5, in that context. There's been some back and forth already, so let me do a little editing of, and there's also a time constraint, so let me do a little editing of my questions. Absent the sort of build on that Sarah talked about and that Randy talked about, the question is, I think, how gentle density addresses the issue of affordability. The report and many of the city documents that it cites assume that what duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, what I understand to be middle housing, will make housing more affordable. For example, in the April 2020 report that Connie mentioned, it says that, quote, incentivizing middle housing types in high opportunity, high cost single family zones could create more affordable housing options, address segregation and inequality, and moderate housing costs. But the question is how? As best as I can understand it, refined after just 4 months. The report and the city documents are relying on the brute market mechanism. If you increase supply, you'll do something about prices. Now, there's a certain irony in this, in that both racial segregation and the affordability crisis are classic examples of, among other things, market failures. But here's the real problem. Increased supply really drives down prices when supply exceeds demand. And I ask you, do you really believe that gentle density increases are going to produce enough supply to exceed or come even close to demand? And if it doesn't, what are we doing about affordability? We may produce more housing, but not affordable housing. Now, I will save what I think we ought to do to a later date. But let me I want to just go back to the history, because I also have a problem. I think a lot of the solutions are driven by the group's reading of the history. Under recommendation 5, this group says older neighborhoods that developed organically often had a mix of housing types, single family homes next to duplexes, triplexes, or quadplexes. That is this neighborhood in spades. The notion that we do not have this mix already is wrong. Then the report says this middle housing, quote, disappeared with the advent of exclusionary zoning. Now, I don't see a definition of exclusionary zoning in the glossary, but I'm sure it included the racial covenants, discriminatory lending, and so forth that is cited there. If I understand the logic of the report, it is that these policies and practices segregated the community by eliminating middle housing, and therefore what's needed is to replace the exclusionary zoning with inclusionary zoning, bring back the middle housing, and this will result in greater integration and diversity and a more inclusive community. But here's the problem with the history.
Okay.
The report itself says that exclusionary zoning emerged in its most explicit and virulent form in the 1920s. If you walk around this neighborhood and you look at the dating plaques on buildings, you will realize that it was precisely in this period that duplexes, triplexes, and quadruplexes were built in this community. It's not that exclusionary zoning stopped the building of building types, it's that they were racist. And we've got to address the racism, but we're not going to do it with building types. I would be happy to say what I think we would do it with, but my time is up and then some. Thank you.
Time's up, right?
Yes. Well, thank you for that. And Peter, I encourage you to send in your recommendations outside of this and offline as well. Randy, Connie, Sarah, would you like to address Peter's comments?
Sarah, you want to address the historical aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Peter, you've probably already read it, but for anyone else listening, if you haven't read it already, I strongly recommend reading The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It goes into detail about how we transitioned, not we as in DC, but we nationally transitioned from racially explicit exclusionary policies to a more on its face racially neutral policies that had the exact same impact and honestly the exact same intent as well. And zoning policies are definitely part of that. Zoning used to be not just racial covenants, but there used to be zoning laws in the same way that now we say only single family houses can be built. It used to be only houses for white people could be built. If you look at the FHA map from 1937 that detailed what neighborhoods had to remain all white, that map, if you overlay it onto what neighborhoods now have single family zoning requirements, it's an almost exact match. And so that's the line that we were drawing when we went from the racially explicitly exclusionary zoning to the policies that look racially neutral today, but are actually not racially neutral. So, and Connie, I will turn it over to you to address the second half of Peter's comment.
Randy, did you want to speak first? I felt like you wanted to say something. Okay. I think in the report, we said it's true. You know, if you turn a house into a duplex, we asked this question ourselves, you know, are we assured that we can get can it become really affordable? And what's in the toolkit to do that? And so we pushed that recommendation forward to the ANC to look at the fiscal toolbox to make sure that people who want to come here can come here. And what can we do if someone were to really purchase it, turn it into a duplex, and then charge double the amount? I mean, I certainly don't want that. But those are things that are in the question mark, right? I don't believe that not doing it is going to allow things as they stand to bring more affordability. I mean, that's the counterfactual. Like, if you just left it this way, is it really going to bring more affordable housing? I'm not sure. If you're able to change our ability to have just exercise more options, then those of us who really want to make this happen, we could ask the questions of the people who can tell us how to make this work. So if we're not so keen on private developers coming in and kind of taking us for a ride, then we built in percentages there that they must provide these kinds of affordable housing that's for families as well, for the needs that are identified. I think we have to do that work. I don't want to say any more. I know that there's a lot of questions, but I think the work group is saying, let's consider, let's see how this can work, and let the ANC do that work. That is where we stand, I think. There are many questions. And Randy, I think you want to jump.
No, I don't want to jump in. I just want to make sure that we get more questions in, and I would really appreciate it if people who are responding to the questions could be very, very brief if possible. Yeah. And we just want to get to more questions. And Jerry, if you could just let people know when their 3 minutes is up, because we're never going to get to everybody if we just let them talk as long as they want.
No, true.
No question has been over 3 minutes yet.
Yes.
Andrea, you're up next. You're unmuted.
Well, Jerry, let me just chime in. It seems as if there's a worry in the community that this is the only opportunity. And I just want to encourage that this is not the only opportunity. We are looking at the time for tonight's session, which we had slated to end at 9 o'clock. But this will not be your only opportunity to speak out. And please know that the ANC will not take any action without the community input.
I was just going to suggest that we've just canceled our ANC meeting for the 23rd. Yeah. And we could resume this on the 23rd if people are interested in doing that, because it's very important for the community and we want to hear from everybody. I regret that we're taking more time with questions and answers than we should, or than I thought we would.
Yes, no, but
maybe that's good. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know.
And think about it, it's the practicality of Zoom. As everyone know, we are in difficult times and difficult and unusual situations. Perhaps if we were in person, it would be different, but yes. So please know that this conversation will be continued. So Jerry, back to you.
Andrea, you're unmuted. You can speak now.
Okay. I don't really have to repeat.
Identify yourself, please.
I'm sorry?
Identify yourself, please.
Oh, sorry. Andrea Rosen. Longtime resident. I don't really need to repeat the question that I put in the chat, I don't think, other than, and it's not really a question, it's more of a statement. I haven't seen any evidence in this city of building more homes on a lot where there was once a single family residence. As far as I can tell, it does not produce affordable housing. In fact, if you go onto Morrison Street, there was a rather small and not very well taken care of house that was purchased, a single family residence demolished, and two semi-detached homes were built there in their place, and each sold for over $2 million. And I don't know what the price of the original house was, but I think it was well below that. At any rate, I just would like to put in a plea for a wider outreach than ANC meetings ever really reach in contributing to this outcome, because there was a survey done about how people felt about the comp plan revision, and in particular, the upplumbing or the increase of density on Connecticut. But things like gentle density were not part of the conversation. And I don't really think the ANC has the right to take measures or recommend things that are not solidly based in community sentiment. And that is all I have to say.
Yes. No, thank you, Andrea. And as ANC commissioners, we are the voice of the community, and we will take your comments and concerns. As we mentioned, we're not implementing any changes at this moment. We are asking for community input and simply presenting the work group. To let everyone know behind the scenes that may not be know, the ANC is working on a community engagement outreach plan. There is in the recommendations a talk of a future survey for the community on various issues. So there are things that are in place that will be announced at future dates. Jerry?
Okay, the next speaker is Pat. There's two Pats, so I'm going to allow one of the Pats to talk, and hopefully that's the right one.
Oh. It's not Pat, it's Dick. We live in the same house.
So you need to
As
turn
a
off
former
your-
member.
Wait.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Maybe
Jerry?
we'll come back to Pat.
Yeah.
If we're going to go to Susan now. Susan, you're on.
Susan?
Mute.
You're on mute.
Am I off mute now?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make a 30-second comment. I just want to say that not all developers are created equal, that there are a number of nonprofit developers in the city, and that we serve precisely the aims that we're talking about here. So I would just like to say that I would hope that any RFP or any request for participation would be extended to nonprofit developers who regard racial equity as their highest mission. Thank you.
Say who you are. They don't say who you are.
That's all I have to say.
Susan, if you could identify the nonprofit development organization.
Okay, first of all, I'd just like to reveal that I'm president of Habitat for Humanity of Washington, D.C. We serve the entire city, but primarily wards 7 and 8.
Yes.
And there are other nonprofits, MANA, Mikasa, Housing Up, Jubilee. I'm happy to work with Randy, who I'm in contact with quite a bit, to give a list of nonprofit developers who would respond to some of the things that we're talking about.
Thank you very much.
Okay, next we have Sophia. Sophia, you're unmuted, so unmute yourself and go ahead.
Susan, you didn't identify you here.
I did.
No, you didn't.
Sophia,
I told you at the beginning. I said, say who you are.
please unmute yourself.
And Suzanne, you're not on mute.
Okay, then we'll go to the next. We have Alan Sieber. You're unmuted, so please go ahead and speak.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I want to just very quickly. First of all, as a term of art, affordable housing is means tested and subsidized. Secondly, I believe that the exclusionary barrier in Chevy Chase is not race any longer, it's economic. And if we look at the economic issue exposed on Livingston and Morrison Streets, again, you see a duplex built in place of a single, which sold for $2 million. So $2 million for one of the duplexes. And so if you were to look at that, as we discussed briefly in the panel on the comp plan, taking a property like that, a demolition, take a double, which is split vertically, split it again in the horizontal, and you get 4 units. Even if you did, unless you bring in money from outside, you cannot reach affordability. If we consider the community center and putting workforce housing there, you know, that's not affordable housing. It may be affordable to the teachers, but it is not, it doesn't fit the term of art. So if we support the building putting the teachers there in that complex, in that campus, the way you must do it is with substantial sums of money brought in from outside. If you take, to carry this on, if you take the Safeway and build housing in that space, assuming you could, any of the other properties, you know, similarly, but at 60,000 square feet where the Safeway is, that's $30 million for the property. And if you build upon it, what you get in some is it's about $2,500 a month for someone to live there. Okay, and that's at 100% MFI. You know, so on this, I endorse Andrea Rosen's remarks and Mara's especially. Finally, I would observe that you leave out in the housing report the normal way that there are rentals in this area, and that is basements and rooms to rent. And they do occur. I mean, I know of them, we all know them, and they're unpermitted. When you address, however, the alleyways in the manner that you did, I published my remarks about that today in a listserv, summarized, you are making major changes to the alleyways in ways that were removed in the early part of the 20th century. And to argue that the reason that occurred was strictly racist is, it certainly was racist, egregiously racist, deliberate, et cetera, et cetera. But there was a serious problem with basically areas of the city unpoliced, not just in terms of law and order, but health-wise, every other way. It took them, Eleanor Roosevelt spent a large, you know, a great amount of time to get rid of that stuff. And now for us to start talking about and placing it and failing to consider that you've got all sorts of issues there to drop into a backyard, a modular unit, into what are you going to flush the toilet? I mean, there are a host of considerations, legal considerations, et cetera. You're not facing it. I think you've got to slow down. You've got to talk to the community. I'm the third or fourth person to speak. You've got a lot of ground to cover.
Yes.
Time to do it. You need to take your time, go the next 6 months or 8 months or whatever it is. We'll get vaccines sooner or later, we'll be able to meet. You've got to attend to business in the community or you will face an uprising.
Yes.
I'm done, thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ellen McCarthy. Ellen, you're unmuted, so please go ahead.
I just wanted to make the point that if we are relying on private development, private developers have to borrow money in order to construct a project, and they have to compete with everybody else that wants to borrow the money. So to create below market housing, one has to either use public land like the library, or one has to have a substantial subsidy from the city. And that is the reality. But we have the option, which the ANC has endorsed, to increase the permitted density along the avenue, and then using IZ plus, as Randy referred to, which is inclusionary, proposed before the Zoning Commission, where if you get bonus density because the future land use map has been changed and therefore the zoning can be increased, giving you increased density, then you are required to set aside a certain percentage of that increased density for affordable housing. That's the way that we achieve affordable housing, unless we want to use public subsidy. But the city sets aside more than $100 million every year for the Housing Production Trust Fund. Affordable housing units cost way more than $100,000 per unit. So, and we provide more funding for affordable housing per capita than any other municipal jurisdiction. So we've got to look for ways to have as many arrows in the quiver as possible. One of them is inclusionary zoning, increased density, gentle density, you know, whether a laneway house, as they have in the alleys in Oregon, or semi-detached houses meet the MFI definition of affordability, doesn't really matter so much as providing as many housing alternatives as possible. And right now, if I want to move to a smaller, less expensive house in the neighborhood and let somebody else have my big house, if I want my children to live in the neighborhood, there is next to nothing in the way of alternatives. And that's what I think we need to keep focused on. It's a capitalist system. We can't just tell somebody, you've got to put affordable housing on your land. We've got to figure out a way to make that work without confiscating the value of the land. But there are tools that we can use to do that. There are not as many as we would like, but the task force report is recommending a number of them, and I think we need to pursue that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Sophia looks like she's going to give it another try. So if you unmute yourself, you can speak now. Okay, then we'll skip again. And we'll give Pat another try. Pat, you're unmuted. Unmute yourself, only one computer at a time, and go for it.
It's not Pat, it's Dick, but we live in the same house.
Okay.
Thank you.
We live on Livingston Street, and I would like to hear some discussion how you would preserve the village atmosphere that is along Connecticut Avenue. Putting in high rises on Connecticut Avenue destroys the neighborhood, destroys the ability of people to come together and talk in a bar, in a restaurant, at a coffee shop, or just waiting for the bus. It seems to me counterproductive to what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat. All right. Would the housing work group like to address Pat's question?
Yes, I'd like.
I think, well, go ahead, Sarah, go ahead.
Okay, so I think, and while I address your comment, I'm also going to address Sophia's comment that she wrote in the comment, just that way, because I think they're both asking the same thing, especially since Sophia's mic is having trouble. And Sophia wrote, to add on to what Pat and Dick are saying, there are also reasons that Chevy Chase is such a coveted place for people to live. People want to live here because we are shielded from violence, crime, unkempt properties, trash, neighborhood noise at all hours. We live here for the same schools and people all striving for the same things in life, which is growth in life and success. And I want to say to both of those comments that greater diversity does not destroy the character of the neighborhood. Greater diversity improves the character of the neighborhood. And to suggest that having a greater diversity of people, whether it is by income or wealth or by race, would somehow destroy our character, would somehow cause increased violence or unkempt properties, is deeply, deeply troubling and problematic and against the spirit of this work, this task force.
Okay. Randy, did you? Thank you, Sarah.
No, I was just going to say we ought to get more questions in, more comments.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear more of those.
I just gave Kevin the floor. He said he would pass if we needed time, but we have a chance now. So Kevin, go ahead. You're unmuted. Kevin, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, maybe he's
There
not.
you go. Okay.
Okay,
So
great.
just pass. I'm happy to read the report, and I'm really enjoying this conversation. So keep it up.
Thank you for coming.
Sure.
Gary, next question.
We seem to have a couple of people have dropped out that wanted to raise their hand to ask questions. A Tony and an Al, but they're no longer on this call. I don't think there are any outstanding questions right now. So if there are any more questions, either raise your hand or enter it into the Q&A. Or if not, I'll let Shanda, how about you asking somebody a question?
I see a hand up.
Okay, yes, that's Andrew. Andrew, you're unmuted, so go ahead and speak.
Sure. Good evening, everyone, and thank you to the ANC and to all the committee heads who have pulled this together. I had the pleasure of sitting in on a number of the Housing Committee meetings and was really impressed with both the thoughtfulness and level of detail that went into this work product. And I just wanted to echo the comments of Ellen McCarthy, who, for those who don't know, is one of the former planning directors for the city. But there are a number of arrows in the quiver in terms of how these issues can be addressed. They're outlined in the report. And I think if people really took the time to read them and understand them, the ANC, I think, has set a really good template in terms of getting a small area plan for the Gateway corridor. And through the community input with that process, as well as whatever ANC process, there will be a lot of opportunity for community discussion to arrive at a consensus around the future of our neighborhood. But ultimately, this is about addressing barriers that have been put in place. And I think we need to be very thoughtful in how we move forward as a community to really untie those past actions. I think everyone acknowledges that they were there. So, this is about how we undo that or move forward and maybe set a template for the city.
Okay.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, I always feel it's good to follow up a question from one Andrew with a question from another Andrew. So Andrew Scheib, you're on. Unmute yourself and you can speak.
Oh, hello. I'm sorry. I wrote the text, my question in chat in Q&A. It doesn't need to be, I'm actually surprised to be speaking. I'm sorry. My question is this. There are studies that, at least from the Brookings Institution and others, I read through the report and the recommendations from the ANC. I did not notice any economic studies that stand for propositions that I didn't see any of the studies that are critical of rent control.
Yeah.
Rent control, to my understanding, and I did once live in New York City. I understand the concept of the illegal sublet, the effect that it had on people who remained for very, very long times in undermarket properties, and the inability of landlords, and there are many that did want to do good work to improve property. In any event, there's a 2018 study that seems to show, it's from the Brookings Institution, it's a pretty good study, high quality research and very heavily degreed people who have demonstrated that in the long run, it decreases rent affordability and that it reduces the amount of quality and affordable rental property that's available to people. I was wondering if that study had been considered or anything. I was wondering if that study had been considered. That's simply my question. Thank you.
I can respond to that. We didn't, I don't think we saw that particular study, but we did look at a lot of studies that were critical of rent control and the downsides for rent control. That's why our recommendation is not, there's a bill before the council right now that would change rent control pretty substantially. And we did not think we had enough information to be able to say one way or the other, whether that was good, bad, or indifferent. But we said that the ANC should really study that. And this is an issue that is going to be before the council very soon, if not this year, then next year.
I understood the report to say that the ANC would recommend that the council update the city's rent control laws so that it applied to more properties.
We want to update it so that it makes sense. That's, I think, where we want to go. And maybe that is including more properties, maybe it's not. Or maybe it's doing it in a different way. But we want to look at that. Rent control is clearly something that ought to be looked at, particularly if the council is at this very moment considering what to do with it in the future.
Mm-hmm. Could the text of the report then be modified to say not that to state that there isn't, it sounds as if there isn't a recommendation at this point, that in fact it's not to necessarily recommend an expansion of rent control, but would you be willing to say that it should be studied?
Sure, that's exactly what we want to do.
Okay, good. Yes, thank you.
Jerry, are there any other?
There's two people that have already spoken, Andrew Orbach and Mara. I'm blanking on her last name, but since there are no other first timers, they're responding to things that have already been said. So first one.
Could we ask Jerry that they keep their remarks very, very short because it's 9 o'clock. We said we were going to end at 9. I think we ought to stick to that. But I'm perfectly willing to have another session on the 23rd or at some later date. This is not, as Shanda said, this is not the only opportunity, nor even this year will these be the only opportunities. There will be multiple opportunities over the next years to address these issues.
Right, but since we have them on now, let's give them the opportunity, but please, as Randy suggests, Mara, you can unmute yourself and speak.
And then prior to that, Jerry, just before Mara, we want to discuss after our two last questions, Randy and the other commissioners and I will talk to you about our next steps in this process. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jerry, for the questions.
Mara, you're on.
Hi, everyone. I was just responding, and I don't really need to speak at length at all here. I do think it's really crucial that there be an agreement that there be no vote on anything until there's an opportunity for far more people to be engaged in this discussion and process. As Janet pointed out earlier, there's only about 44 people that have participated in this discussion tonight. You have thousands of people affected by this. Clearly, the community doesn't know about it. And I'd like the ANC to actually agree that there will be no vote on anything until the new ANC takes office in January, since the community has elected new representatives rather than a lame duck approach, and also just plainly because the community has not been engaged in this process and it's extremely improper. And just as a side note, Sarah, you really incorrectly characterized one of the comments where someone was talking about the village-like nature of Connecticut Avenue racist. That's extremely unfair, and they didn't do that. And I really think you should retract that.
Thank you for that comment, Mara. However, I want everyone to know our ANC has all throughout our process been open and transparent. We are And at no point in time have we ever said that we're going to make decisions without including the community. As a matter of fact, we have additional steps built into this process to have the community speak at additional times, whether it be ANC meetings, written comments, or things of that nature. And so, as Mara correctly mentioned, since we knew that there may be a small number of people attending, we want to continue this process. And so we will do that with more community input. Next question, Jerry.
Andrew had a follow-up comment. Andrew Orbach.
No, I think that was just a vestige of trying to get in the first time.
Okay.
But thank you.
Sure. Then there are no further questions. 12 different individuals had a chance to speak tonight. So that's a start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And with that, Randy, did you want to discuss the next steps?
Well, number one, there have been suggestions that we should decide tonight that we're not going to vote on this in this year. We can't do that because we only have 3 commissioners here, for one thing. We don't have a quorum. And so that we can't do that.
No.
But
Actually, we
will discuss this at later meetings, and we'll have plenty of opportunity. This commission can decide whether to postpone it or not, and we'll debate that at some point in the future. Our next scheduled meeting, since we canceled our November 23rd meeting, is on December 14th. There's nothing to say we couldn't have meetings between now and then, though, and we could have another meeting of the town hall on the 23rd, and I would be perfectly willing to do that if other commissioners are willing, if Shannon and Jerry would like to do that, and if there are other people in the community who want to participate in that. We've spent a whole lot of time, the task force members have spent a whole lot of time on this. We're not about to walk away from it and say, okay, we can't spend another couple of hours talking about this again. We've already invested a lot of time, and we're committed to investing even more time.
And our ANC is committed.
Right, and so it's going to be, we're going to keep working on this for, as I said before, years. This is the beginning of a long process, but it's one that I think is healthy for our community to talk about these issues, even if we disagree, because I think all of us are working toward a similar goal, and that is having a better Chevy Chase DC for all of us and for everyone to have access to, for everyone to enjoy the benefits of what we've got here. And we want to preserve those benefits and share them. So
yes.
With that, Shannon, anything you want to add?
Yes, and I will say, and I remind everyone, if you weren't here at the beginning, that this is a groundbreaking and seminal, all of these 3 working group reports are seminal, and that no other communities are doing what the Chevy Chase DC community are doing. So for that, I commend you for putting forth these groundbreaking and thought-provoking issues. They do deserve discussion. We will look at all sides, as our ANC has always done. Our ANC has always been about the community voice and will continue to be about the community voice. And I'm thankful as an African-American woman to be on and a part of a community group that looks at diversity, equity, and inclusion and race, and looks at it in all facets across the board. Our ANC is committed. As you know, our background, I want to let you know that we're not a haphazard organized group. Our ANC will come up with outlines. We will come up with recommendations, including you, and have a process and work with you hand in hand on these recommendations. So, Randy, I know that you raised the possibility of November 23rd. What I suggest that we do is discuss it as commission and send out a notice to the community within the next day or two of our next scheduled meeting, because we do have time, as you said, to gather community input again prior to our December 14th meeting.
Okay, that sounds good to me.
Okay. So with that, I would like to thank everyone and thank Jerry and Commissioner Speck, as well as all our work group panelists who participated, and to you as the community as questioners. Thank you for these sometimes tough and thought-provoking questions. We're doing a lot of work that other communities haven't grappled with, and I encourage you to continue to walk hand in hand with us along the way. So thank you again, and please feel free to email all the commissioners and the work groups with your comments and input. And thank you for taking this 2 hours out of your Monday night to spend it with ANC 34G as we begin to look at the future and be a beacon of light, of hope for the future in our community. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. Good night.